All right, folks. By my phone and watch, it says it's time to start. So why don't we get started here? So if you don't know me, I'm Steve Lee. I'm the Engineer Manager for PowerShell, OpenSSH on Windows, and also DSC and other things like Gallery, Script Analyzer, blah, blah, blah. But for today's session, we're going to focus on desired state configuration v3, the latest updates. This is a work in progress, which is what this image is kind of showing in a bit. And we're going to go over what's happened, give some demos, and talk about the future for DSCv3. And we'll have a bunch of time at the end for questions. So if you do have questions, I think the easiest way to do this for now, because I have the presentation up, I can't see what's going on in Gather. Just go ahead and put it in the chat, and I will answer those as they come in later. All right, so let's do a quick recap. And by the way, this session I do expect that you do have some experience with DSC already, so I'm not going to go over that in detail. But if you don't, then the general concept is really configuration as code, declarative syntax. So you're really trying to say, this is what I want and make it happen, versus writing like a PowerShell script where you handle all the logic and error handling and logging and all this stuff yourself. One of the primary focuses of the new DSC is really on the resources side. We'll talk about configuration as well later, but it's really, how do we have a bigger addressable market, get more folks involved in using and authoring DSC, and really it's about the resources. That's where a lot of value is. So one of the primary things we focused on is really how to make it easier to write a resource. And I'm going to show a demo of a simple resource I wrote yesterday for today's demo. However, PowerShell is still important to us. I still own PowerShell. And of course, we're going to continue to support existing PowerShell script and class-based resources. This is also a work in progress. I'm not going to necessarily show some demos of that today, but it is something that we're going to continue to enhance. And also, it is going to continue to leverage the PS desired state configuration module, which is how we integrate the two things together. So look forward to a proper 3.0 version of that in the future. Okay. One of the big changes, though, speaking of configuration, is we're moving away from MOF, which is the old managed object format used by primarily WMI and SIM. We're moved towards using ARM. It's really currently a strict subset of the ARM template syntax, although we support both YAML and JSON and not just JSON. And I'll talk more about that during the demo session. The idea here really is you learn, if you already know ARM templates, then you should feel right at home within DSC. If not, and you learn DSC, then you'll feel right at home with ARM templates. And the idea here is rather than inventing a new syntax or leveraging some of the old stuff, we can actually also allow configuration authors to use existing tooling that already exists today for ARM templates. And one of the things that we are designing from the start is really making this cross-platform. In fact, the demo I'm going to give today is from my primary development machine, which is a MacBook Pro. And so the demo will be on Mac. But currently, we do have packages available for Windows and Linux as well. And it is open source. I will show the repo later during the session where I'm going to talk about what new things are coming, which are not available just yet. All right. So again, I want to highlight one thing that we're doing differently with DSC than we've done with other projects in the past is it really started almost from the beginning. I mean, there was some code that that was written before we made the repo public, but we're very much still early days. So we're calling this an alpha phase. So there are bugs, which is what this image represents. So it is definitely not intended for production. Right now, the releases that we have are really intended for developers who kind of start getting their feet wet, start understanding how things are different, opening issues that they're finding, things like that. One thing is that if you had not been following along already, is that based on feedback and based on our own internal usage and testing, we have been taking a number of breaking changes because, it's hard to know whether something's going to work in a spec. And then when we actually write the code, we're like, hey, this works, but maybe this is slightly better. Or maybe we learn certain things from other products or other partners or other industries and say, hey, this is a better way of doing it. And right now during alpha stage, we are breaking changes left and right. So just be aware of that. We do have a number of features that are still in development that is part of what will eventually get to a beta release. These are all primarily open as issues on the GitHub repo, and I try to kind of categorize or group them into projects that align with different alpha releases, which I think I'll cover more in a bit as well. And right now, we do have some primary partners that we're working with internal at Microsoft. Azure Machine Config. So you also might know this as Azure Guest Config, but they're kind of branching out beyond like guest on top of a hypervisor. So obviously they are using DSCv2 today. And so we're working with them so that they can leverage DSCv3 to make it easier for themselves and for partners to write DSC resources so you can actually do management across Linux and Windows and Azure more easily. WinGet, if you missed Dimitri's session this morning, he covered WinGet Configure specifically, which is leveraging DSCv2, and we are working with them so that they can shift over to DSCv3. Of course, since we are in alpha, it makes it a little bit more challenging for them. But one of the things that he covered is they'll have a side-by-side mode where you can opt into preview stuff versus something that's a bit more stable that they've already released. And some other partners that we're not disclosing at this time. Now, I did mention, like right now, we are trying to stick with a monthly cadence for alpha releases. We currently have 3, I believe, right now. And October is almost to an end, so we're almost time for another one. And I wanted to also show change logs. Let me switch. I need to share a different thing real quick. Hide that. Let's see. This one. All right. So I want to give a shout out to Mikey, who I believe is in the room. He's been doing a phenomenal job documenting V3 as it continues to evolve and change. And one of the things he did, because he didn't like the generated change log that we have in the releases, is actually having more documentation, clarification on what all the different changes are, linking to the issues and PRs. So this is some great work here. And this I expect to continue to be updated once we have Alpha 4, hopefully this month, as we continue to make progress. So you can kind of see how things are changing in here. And let's see, and if Mikey is there, maybe he can drop a link to that directly into the chat as I bring the presentation back up. Let's see this one. Okay. So let's talk a bit about the roadmap. Currently, and these are all tentative, okay, but these are all targets that I'm trying to hit, which is getting into a beta by end of Q1. So end of Q1 will be end of March at the latest. Hopefully we'll get there before, but that's kind of like what we're targeting. What does beta mean? So beta means that when we're shifting out of alpha towards beta, it means it'll be feature complete, right? So all the planned features for the what I'm currently thinking will be the 3.0 release will be everything needed by our partners and also as a platform. It doesn't mean that it is done, because obviously as we get more feedback, we'll continue to enhance it with the 3.1, 3.2 and stuff like that. But it means that we are going to shift from working on features into bug fix mode. So there's a bunch of to-dos in the code, like stuff we know that is not critical right now to kind of get partner feedback, but those things will be addressed during this phase. As feedback comes in through our GitHub repo, we'll continue to address those. So that's why it's important for people playing with it for now. Again, right now, the main thing that you can kind of play with is authoring resources. You can do some configuration, but it's still limited right now. There's more. I'll talk more about that when we get after the demo, I think. And ideally, I would love to see a general availability by mid 2024. But again, there's a question mark here because it really, like, we're not date driven at this point for this project. So we're really kind of looking at it from a quality driven perspective. So as feedback comes in, as we get partners lined up, we'll have to figure out when an appropriate GA date is so that we can also make our partners successful so we're not holding them back. All right, so this is kind of like the meat of it. So it's time for the demo. So I'm going to skip out of here. And let me share VS Code. Let me see, I got to find the gather window. Actually, before I go to demo, let me just go through some chat, see if there's any Q&A real quick. Let me see. All right, a bunch of stuff about drinking. JSON to Bicep, yes. I'll just say that we've had one conversation with the Bicep team. Nothing to announce yet, but the idea there is hopefully you can use Bicep as a way to author DC configuration. Oh, okay, yes. Let's see, one git, yes. Changes log, okay. So let me share, let me find VS Code here. This one. All right. So let me, before we get to that, I think what I want to show first, let's see how do I want to do this. Okay. I'm going to assume for now that people in this room probably have seen my previous DSCv3 presentation, so I'm not necessarily going to go into some of those other details for now, but if there are questions that come up, I'm more than happy to cover that in detail following this demo. But what I wrote here that you see on the screen is actually an example resource, not deliberately not written in PowerShell, to show that you can do it in other languages. This is actually written as a bash script, and this is actually a resource, a very simple resource for managing packages on macOS using Homebrew. I'll go over the details in a little bit, and I wanted to write this. I should also highlight one of the new features we added in DSC in the last, I think in the last alpha, which is how to pass basically a JSON payload to a resource and not have the resource have to parse JSON. Okay, so let me first go to make some of these things. Oh, I can't make it smaller. Okay, so as a kind of refresher, the way that DSCv3 finds DC resources is through this DC resource JSON file. So every resource, with the exception of PowerShell, so PowerShell still found the way it's found today through PS module path as a module. But for non-PowerShell resources, you need to have this JSON file that tells DSC that you're a resource, and there's sections in here tells DSC how to call, right? So here, this is this is a very simple Homebrew resource. I wrote a couple of tags, and again, there's a separate issue open up on the repo already. Like, what are some standard tags that we should probably define so that it makes it easier for people to find things for what they want to do. And here, I have a single script, which I'll get to back in a bit, but basically it does get, set, and export. So export is a new capability that we added, forget which alpha specifically. And this is something that Demetrius had talked about in his presentation, where, you know, this is, some people used to call it reverse DSC, where you've either applied configuration or you've manually configured something, you know, whether it's VS Code, IIS, or whatever it may be. As long as that thing has a DSC resource that supports export, it means that after you've configured it, you could actually export all those settings out and you could reapply it, or you could actually take those settings and apply it to lots of other machines. So for example, in the IIS case, you may want to manually configure one website or multiple websites and then export all those websites out and then reapply those on hundreds of other instances, right? Another scenario might be that you want, assuming that we have a plethora and large amount of DC resources, you may want to say, I want to export all the settings I have for my Windows dev box before I apply something else. That way I have a backup that I can get back to, right? So these are different scenarios that will be used for export. And I'll show export in a bit, how that works today. But basically, the key thing here is really there's different sections for get, set, and test is not implemented in this by design. But there's a new thing for input. So input takes, and I think we have some tab completion here. So I think if I do this, yeah, so right now it has, well, in the branch that I'm working on, it has two. There's actually some other ones that are in progress. But you can do standard in, which is very common. And a lot of the other resources in the repo use standard in as a way to get the JSON input. But in this case, I deliberately want to kind of exercise the environmental variable one. So the way this works is, if I go to my example YAML here, so let's go to this one, right? And I'll talk about this assertion in a bit, but basically here, this is using the DSC package management brew resource, and it has two properties. One is the package name. I'll talk about what this get UI thing is in a second, and this other thing called exist, which I'll talk about in a bit. But before I get to that, basically what the environmental variable input means is that it only supports a flattened list, so you can't have nested objects. You can have arrays, but becomes a common delimited string. But the idea here is that if you have an environment or language that maybe for whatever reason doesn't have a good JSON parser, or you have a very simple case where my structure of my properties are very simple, they're just flattened name value pairs, then basically when DSC invokes my resource, it's going to pass this property package name and this property underscore exists as environmental variables. So let me just jump back into, actually, do I have it? I have it here somewhere, right? I should have closed, I need to close some of these other ones, but let me go here, right? So here, I have a comment in here because if you're not familiar with Bash, basically this dollar variable name is the way access the contents of it, but basically this is, I don't have this variable defined in here at all. It's basically being, DC, when it spawns this shell script, which is going to be treated as an executable, it's going to set the environment for that new process, and it's going to populate package name with whatever set in the JSON. Then also lower down here, dollar exists. So this is also going to be set. And again, I'll talk about how this is being used in a bit. I want to go back to explaining this configuration here. Let me talk about underscore exists real quick. So this is a change from DSCv2. So again, prior, if you're familiar with DSC, then you would probably see ensure, right? Ensure, absent, and present. And one of the things that came up as we were doing this development is we needed a way to specify the equivalent of ensuring something is either absent or something is present. But we also needed to be able to return the state with those properties, because if you don't implement tests, then DSC is going to do what we call synthetic tests and actually just do a direct comparison of the inputs and outputs, basically. And it felt weird, or didn't make sense to us, that a resource would return a property called ensure. Ensure is more of a verb, like a directive, whereas exist is more like a property or a noun, right? So we changed that to underscore exists true false, which is the equivalent where exists is true, meaning present, and exists is false, is absent. And this and the convention here, and anything that starts with the underscore, by the way, is kind of like what we're calling, I think we call it common keyword. I forget what the actual term that we're using. And Mikey can correct me in the chat. But basically, these are going to be a set of properties that are going to be well defined to have specific meaning. Therefore, any resource that supports it will follow that convention, right? So this is kind of like how verbs in PowerShell have specific meanings. You don't get to pick your own. That way, if you're using different resources and they have underscore exists, they all mean the same thing from a DC perspective. Whereas if somebody had an exists without the underscore, it could take different values, and those values may mean different things. So again, here I'm using this brew resource. It's there's a package called Get UI. Maybe I can just show that real quick if you're not familiar with this. Let me show where's my terminal. All right, Get UI is actually a tool I like to use. In fact, if I'm in the repo, so I do have something I changed. So basically, if you're doing a lot of Git stuff, and by the way, Get UI does work on Windows, Linux, and Mac OS. But if you bring this up, it's really cool, because instead of doing the old Git status and then I do Git add and do Git commit and stuff like that, I can just use this as a way to see, oh, these are the changes. I can see the diff. You can tab through different things, logs, files, blah, blah, blah. And if I were to accept this, then I can commit this. In this case, I'm not going to accept that. I need to make that change for this demo to work, but that's what that tool is. So, but I'm also picking this tool because it's a very small tool to install and uninstall versus, for example, PowerShell 7 takes longer to install, or at least install. Anyways, going back to this configuration. So here, because I'm using Brew, this is only going to work on Mac OS. So I have this depend on this assertion group. So the assertion group is a new thing for DSCv3. So this is a group resource, which is implemented by DSC itself. And basically it says, so name is a friendly name, is whatever I as a user can call it, so that I can remind myself what this is for. But there's this other resource that is in the repo called OSInfo that just returns, is it Mac, Windows, Linux, is it 64-bit, 32-bit, things like that. But basically this is saying only run, so this thing should depend on this. An assertion group basically will take any number of DSC resources, but regardless of whether you're doing a get, set, or test, it will always do a test. And if any test fails, then this assertion will fail and the rest of this won't run as long as there's the correct dependency. So let me show that real quick here. Back to my terminal. All right, dang it. I wanted to, maybe I'll make this smaller. Okay, so if I were, let me just make sure I do a quick build so everything's set up correctly. This won't take too long because most stuff is already built. I'll talk about this tree setter stuff later as what's coming when we get to that time period. All right, almost there. You can kind of see it's already now we're going to start having the right versions for future releases. Everything was the wrong version prior. Okay, so here let me just cap DC examples. Okay, so oops, dang it. There you go. Okay, here we go. These examples, and this was called brew PSC YAML. So I'm going to pipe that to DC config get. Right, and so this is just going to now run that configuration, calling that resource, and the only thing it's going to do is tell me the state of whether or not this Git UI application is installed. So if I were to actually go up here for a second, you can see the assertion ran in desired state is true because it expected Mac OS, and it is Mac OS. And down here, Git UI is actually installed currently, right? Version 0.24.3. In fact, if I were to do brew list Git UI, it should show this is installed. So because it's installed, I'm going to now run this uninstall. So the way this works, so this is actually exactly the same as this one with one difference, which is I flipped exist from false to true, or from true to false, sorry. So if I were to actually run, let's see, cat examples brew install, and if I do DC config, let's do a test here, right? So remember, like the desired state according to this YAML is that I don't want it installed, and it currently is installed, right? So desired state Git UI is false, exist, but it actually is installed, so it's true. So in desired state is false currently, and the differing properties as this exists. So it's doing comparison. Version doesn't get compared because it's comparing from the point of view of desired state. It's not doing a bidirectional diff here. So if I were to now want to uninstall, then I would change this to set. Right, so I'm taking the exact same YAML configuration that I just used for tests, and I could have done it for get as well, because get doesn't really care about the exist property. It'll just tell you what the current state is. So here, before state it was installed. After I ran my configuration, then exist is false. And just to confirm, I'll do this. All right, so no such case. So this is not installed. But if you were to run it through test here, again, this is the uninstall desired state running through test. And by the way, I'll go over the trace effect. So it is now in desired state true because it is not installed anymore. One thing I'll mention, like this is still, the tracing is still work in progress. You can kind of see like there's a lot of debug tracing to the line number. So this will get cleaned up with ability to control how much info you need or want in the future. So that's an open issue. Just be aware that you may see a whole bunch of info, verbose, debug, the type of tracing. All right, so that covers that part. So let me kind of just now close this and kind of explain how this actually worked, which is this script. All right, so again, this is a bash script. And by the way, I'm not a bash expert. I learned it enough to be dangerous to write this. But I'll kind of explain some of this. I'm going to assume that you guys are familiar with PowerShell script, and I'll kind of explain some of the differences if you're not familiar with the bash script. So first here is just really the shebang, so that on macOS, I can treat this script as an executable and not have to call sh directly. Export is needed to make sure that these variables are basically environmental variables accessible to down level processes. So again, I'm going to set this existing to true. This non-interactive is really for brew to not prompt. I wouldn't want it to prompt if I'm running a configuration like to confirm stuff. Otherwise, it'll hang, basically. There's no way to answer that prompt. I have two helper functions here. In this case, one of the required, in fact, if I go back to the resource JSON, like one thing I didn't cover down here is the schema. So this is a very simple schema. It really has just three properties. This is written in JSON schema form. So there's a package name. So this is the name of the package you want to install, uninstall, or see if it is installed or whatever. Version gets returned, but in the time I wrote this resource, I don't support a way to provide resource as an input. So you can kind of think of this as the key for now. By the way, key properties is an open issue that we haven't figured out yet. Well, we have a proposal on how to address, but isn't implemented yet. And of course, as I mentioned, exists is something that you can also pass in. So this is a very simple JSON schema. So for this script to run, and again, I can also show you, go back to the terminal. Like this script, which is called brew. And that tab completing. Oh, I know I double, but if I just do get, I can just run this, but obviously it's going to complain because this package is not set. But if I set it in the environment name, and on macOS, I don't recall if environment over is like case sensitive. On Linux, it is. So I can set this like PowerShell, for example. So the key thing here is like these DC resources, they're command based, meaning non-PowerShell based, or they can just be used directly as command tools. Although in this case, it's going to always emit JSON, and I'll show that in a bit. So it's not as maybe useful as it's currently written. But I have this little function called toJSON, and I'm using awk as a way to kind of parse out the output. So let me just show you again. Terminal. So if I do brew list get UI, which it's uninstalled now, so I have to find something else. I think that wget is on here. Basically, the way this tool works is it's running this command, and it gets the name of the package and the version as a space delimited thing. So that's why I'm using awk here to parse that out, so that $1 is the first part and $2 is the second part. And then I'm going to populate the underscore exists JSON member with the environmental variable exists, which is, again, predefined as true if it's not defined. Otherwise, if it's defined down here, it will be overwritten. On this part, I'm just making sure that some subcommand is provided. So this is a $, hash just means the number of arguments being passed. If it's 0, it means nothing was passed. And then basically I support get, set, and export. Now I'll show export in a little bit. So in the get case, for both get and set, it requires arguments. So I check that. And then I just run this command, save the output. And then I just basically, if there's no output, it means that package doesn't exist, and I still need to populate the JSON. So let me just show that again. So again, if I do brew list PowerShell, I spelled right. So I didn't install PowerShell via brew because I installed PowerShell through our macOS package. So that's empty. So if I pass an empty string up to this JSON, it's never going to print anything because it won't find anything. So that's why I create a fake output, if you will. So for set's a little bit more complicated than get. I basically have to check this underscore exists property, right, which is now being passed in as an environmental variable versus from the JSON input. And depending on if it's true, it means I want to do an install. If it's not true, which means it's going to be false, I do an uninstall. So that's pretty much how get and set works. So let me show export. So let me show you the current output. And I think it does need to get changed. But let's do the example brew. I have a separate one for export. You see config export. All right. So the idea here is that as long as all resources in the configuration support export, it will export a new configuration that I could actually pipe directly back to set. Now, in this case, and which is why I want to make a change here, which is this is enumerating all of the packages that I've ever installed via brew. So you can kind of see like Azure CLI, BAT, something called bottom, which is opposite of top. stuff like that. Or actually, I think bottom may be better top. I don't forget now. But anyways, some of these tools I actually don't use anymore, but I just installed one time. But the idea here is I could take this and take it onto another Mac system and do a config set, and it'll install each of these, but it'll obviously run this serially one after the other. So one of the changes I'm probably going to make before I commit this to the repo is change the export to return an array of packages versus individual ones, so that you have only one instance of this. That actually, I'll have to think whether or not I'll talk to some of the other folks to see which is better. There's pros and cons on both, but I think for package management type resources, it might make sense for an array. Although in this case, some of these actually could potentially run in parallel. Anyways, so that's just using this command. So I'm just listing everything that's installed with the versions, and that again uses my to.json function, and then anything else is invalid. So that's kind of shows you pretty simple how you can write a resource in Bash. And again, this is more of a proof of concept. If you were to write it in some other language like Go, obviously there's a bunch of resources written here in Rust or C# or C++. Like there's probably already JSON parser libraries that you should be leveraging. But you can still pass environmental variables if that's what you want. Let me see. Now I kind of lost my train of thought. What was there? What else did I wanted to show? So I showed export. Let me go back to gather. All right, let me just quickly look through the chat to see if there's anything that came up in terms of questions. Holy cow. There should be, I wish there was a way to see what was the last message I read. All right, so I think, okay, there's a bunch of discussion about bicep. I'm going to skip all that. Looks like those were answered. Yes, the idea is that bicep is a higher level language, compiles down to JSON, even though DSC tooling supports either YAML or JSON. One of the benefits of YAML is that it's more human readable, and also unless your tooling supports JSON-C, you can have comments in YAML and you can have comments in JSON without making it a property. All right, skipping on that. Okay, still a bunch of stuff about bicep. Okay, can the assertion resources be developed similar to regular resources? So the way the assertion, let me show you that here. So again, you saw, here's a different one, right? This is a different example where this is a thing called an assertion group, and basically it has two resources. There's an OS info one, which is expecting Windows, and then there's also a using a registry resource expecting system root to be z:\Windows, which is probably not going to be true. So if either of these two fail, then this one will also not get run at all. So the assertion resource itself, if you look at the resource JSON, is actually just calling DSC itself, right? And basically, whether you're doing a get, set, or test, it's always going to just take the payload, which itself is a configuration, so it's like a nested configuration. It's just going to run test on all the resources that are specified. And that's really all it does. So it's very simple. So if you're building an assertion, if you want to use a resource for an assertion, the resource itself doesn't know about it being used in an assertion. As long as it's in this set of properties for the assertion group, then what the assertion group is going to say, every resource in here, I'm going to run test. And as long as all the tests pass, then the assertion passes. So that's really all it does. Let me see. Something about OS info. Okay, so why choose to use Bash on macOS instead of PowerShell? So the reason I chose Bash was really to show something in a different language. If I wrote it in PowerShell, it would have been much easier. But we already have PowerShell resources. Let's see. Okay, so I think people are already confirming that. Python, yes. Perl, whatever you want. Like that's the key thing, is you can write in whatever language, as long as you have a resource JSON file and you tell DSC how to execute your resource in whatever language you wrote. As long as it's accessible from the command line, then it can become a DSC resource. In fact, one of the hopes that we have is existing command line tools can just expose a different subcommand so that the same tool itself is a DSC resource for itself. So you don't necessarily have to ship 2 things or more things. Let's see. Okay, so yes, DSCx was now written in Rust. So let me cover that for a second. So if you go, I need to make this a little bit smaller so I can find this. So DSC itself has kind of like 2, if you look in the repo, there's 2 folders that matter. There's a DSC lib, which may or may not ever become an actual library outside of DSC. And there's DSC, which is the executable that uses the lib. Both of these, in fact, a lot of the resources are written in Rust. And the reason we wrote it in Rust is we wanted to make sure DSC was accessible in other environments that there are going to be some environments that we want to target that can't even run .NET for whatever reason. Maybe .NET isn't supported on that platform, or maybe that thing is like an IoT device is super tiny and the size that we, PowerShell 7 has a lot of capability because we ship a lot of assemblies from .NET with it. But part of the downside to that is that it's rather large. So in this case, we needed to make sure it's very small, it's native, and that's why we chose Rust as the language for developing DSC itself. If you're not familiar with Rust, I'm not going to go into it here. It's neat, but it's very different. There was, okay, so maybe what I will now cover next, because I don't think there were any other major questions. I want us to talk about what's coming soon. So let me share a different screen, which is going to be this. This is a DSC repo. All right. So we do have a PR that I wrote that is in review, which is basically once this is in, and I'm not going to say that this will be in necessarily by the time the next alpha gets shipped, but if it doesn't make it by the October alpha release, then it'll make it by November for sure. But basically, we're using Tree Sitter. So let me give you a bit more context here. So in ARM templates, you have the ability to have what's called expressions. And expressions, let me see if I go down, this is kind of a large change, but I'm going to go down to my tests here, right? So let me find one that, like, here's maybe one as an example, right? So in the ARM template JSON, and this will be the same for DSC configuration JSON /YAML, is that you can call functions to do certain work as the value of a property, right? So this is just an example. So this is not a real function, obviously, but this is what a tree sitter test looks like. But the idea is that it would have these square brackets and you would have some functions. So in this, as part of this pull request, I implemented, you can kind of see here, there's like a concat function and also a base64 function. But the idea is that there's going to be a whole bunch of these things. You can also use, I think there's like a reference function that you can use so that you can actually take the output from calling one resource as input to something else. So you may have a resource that gets you like the subscription ID or a user group or whatever it is you need, because you need to pass that to something else. So these functions enable that capability. Also, once we have this scaffolding code in to support expressions in general, that means that we can also now add support for parameters so that the actual DSC configuration itself actually becomes a template, meaning that you will have some way via the DSC command to pass in, like maybe you have a generic brew installer or winget installer configuration, but it needs like input, like it needs to know, is this going to be running as the user or admin? Is it going to know what package to install, stuff like that? So those can be passed in as parameters. You could also have stuff like where you have secrets, right? Where you're talking to like an Azure Key Vault or something else that requires some kind of token. So those could be passed in as a parameter. That way you don't have any secrets hard-coded in your configuration itself. So once we have this PR merge, we will have that. We can start adding those capabilities as well. But yeah, I mean, if you're familiar with the tree sitter, feel free to take a look at this PR and give feedback. But basically, I had to construct the grammar for what is, at least for my knowledge base, supported in terms of a Azure template expression, which has both functions, but also has dot notation. So I think, let me see. I think I have another example here for dot notation somewhere. Here we go, dot notation. So this is hidden, but where did it go? Oh, here. So like if you call some function and that function returns a JSON object, again, you could be calling like reference of a output of a resource that you just invoked, then you can access the different members of that JSON object using dot notation, just like you would in PowerShell for properties. So that's all part of an expression. And of course, you can have nested ones. Here's a more complicated one here. Right. So here's a function where one of the arguments is a different function call. Although that one didn't have the nested one, but down here, oh, here's one. Like you call a function as an argument to this other function, but you're passing just a nested property as the argument, and then out of that output, you want to get this other nested property. So this is what this is all shown. But again, once this PR is in, this will enable us to do a lot more interesting things with the configuration side of DSCv3. All right, let me jump quick back to gather to see anything else has come up. Fun and fast to execute. So it is fast, with the exception that if you're using PowerShell, then there is currently a bit more lag because PowerShell discovery through PS module path isn't the fastest thing. We do have a PR that's been open to kind of do some optimization. So if we know that your configuration doesn't use the PowerShell resource at all, then we don't have to do discovery for that. So that would be faster. I don't see any other questions I didn't answer. Let me jump back to my presentation real quick. Let me find that here. This one. All right. Luckily, the demo gods for me were kind, and I didn't hit any major issues here. All right, so call to action. So based on the current state of DSCv3, given that it's alpha, I think that where people can really provide us feedback is on the DSC resource authoring side for now, not the configuration. I think that as we make more progress with getting expressions in and then building parameters, variables, implementing all the different functions and stuff like that, then definitely there'll be more opportunity for people to kind of play with the configuration side. But of course, it's going to be hard to play with the configuration without resources. So again, I think we need to really have people start thinking about cross-platform resources. Again, you can and should continue to develop resources in PowerShell script or PowerShell classes. We do recommend PowerShell classes as the way going forward for that. But we also want people to really kind of exercise writing a command-based resource and giving us feedback like, what challenges did you have? What are things that maybe we can do in our platform to make it even easier? Also think about if things don't work. One thing that we know that we don't have, but there's an open issue is how do resources participate in providing verbose and debug output so that it gets flowed through so you can kind of see it. There's also stuff like what if, which there's an issue for that. Like how's that going to work? We have some ideas on that one. How's that going to flow through to resources and stuff like that? So definitely, this would be a great time to start prototyping resources and giving us that feedback on what works and what needs improvement. All right, I guess we already kind of went through the Q&A, so I think that was my last slide anyways. So let me just go back to gather. Stop sharing. All right. Oh, yes, I forgot. Mikey did implement a sample resource in Go, and he has an awesome repo. And maybe I should move the Bash one over to that samples one. Is there any other questions? By the way, I'm more than happy during this time if you have PowerShell 7 or OpenSSH questions since I'm here. And if we don't have a ton of DSC questions, I'm more than happy to answer those as well for the time remaining that we have, which is about 16 minutes. And if you want to step up to the Q&A mic, you can do that as well. I guess one last thing I would mention for now is that for the DSCv3 repo, we're currently not taking pull requests during the alpha phase, as we are it would take too much time, to be honest, to review community PRs right now. We do plan to probably shift to taking PRs during the beta phase. Yes. Just reading some of the comments about Michael Green also was actively trying to write some resources for demos and samples. The other thing I'll just mention from a call to action, like if you have an interest or have experience with other tooling, there are a bunch of issues that are not like bugs. They're more like discussions on certain design elements that we want. So for example, like the key properties is one. Trying to think off the top of my head now. There's a bunch that are marked as needs review, which are ones that we're going to have the team discuss. But if you have a point of view or have a suggestion on how we can tackle a certain feature area, feel free to comment in that issue on GitHub, and we can certainly take that into consideration. All right. Any other? See, just scrolling, making sure I didn't miss anything. Well, you're very welcome. Hopefully this was a little bit entertaining and hopefully a little bit educating about what's going on. And again, just to kind of reiterate, we're still actively developing this project, hoping to get to a beta by no later than end of March or Q1 of next year. That has to take into account the big US holiday season that's coming up with Thanksgiving, Christmas, New Year's. And then hopefully we'll get to a RC or GA not long after that, depending on the feedback that we get for the beta from both partners and customers. But that's kind of like how things will go. All right, if that is it, I'll still hang out here for a bit. If you have any other questions, again, I'm more than happy to answer any questions beyond even just DSC. I do have a hard stop in 13 minutes. I have another meeting I got to get to soon. Yeah, I see Erwin about Ansible. So again, our goal isn't for DSC isn't to compete with Ansible, Chef, Puppet, or anything like that. It's really building a platform, working with Azure Machine Config as the cloud LCM, if you will, but also enable our partners like Chef, Puppet, and Ansible to integrate. A lot of them already integrate with DSCv2. I think it should be even easier for them if they wanted to integrate with DSCv3. So if you write your resources in DSCv3, imagine that it can be used in many, many places. As someone who worked on WMI since NT4 and was in the DMTF for some time, SIM is not so bad if you get used to it. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of SIM or misappreciation of some of the design decisions they made. But one of the downsides of SIM being that DMTF is a open org and collaborating across like Intel, Broadcom, and all these companies, that everyone wants a little bit different targeting their hardware. So you do get this mess of a lot of optional stuff making it hard. Well, Mikey, nowadays you can use AI to do the meta programming for you. Yeah, based on what Mike is saying, he's done a phenomenal job documenting the JSON schemas, which keep changing on him. All right, folks, I'm probably going to take a short break before my next meeting. So thanks for attending. And if you guys have follow-up questions, hit me up on Twitter or open up issues in the GitHub repo. Thanks.